Out of all the games in Ubisoft's long-running Far Cry series, the 2004 original still stands out nowadays as one of the more unique entries in the franchise. It was the first game Crytek had ever worked on up until that point, and it went down as a bit of a landmark tale for how much more advanced it was compared to its competition. And yet, despite how much of a splash it made back then, the first Far Cry is a tale many people tend to ignore or forget about these days. Even now with Far Cry 6 coming out soon, it feels rare to see people acknowledge the original game when looking at discussions of the series online. It's this lack of interest that made me curious enough to check it out, and the results were certainly interesting, to say the least. What makes Far Cry 1 so interesting to look back on is that it doesn't really share much in common with what you think of the franchise nowadays. The plot is about as B-movie tier as you can get, with protagonist Jack Carver roped into an undercover CIA operation to take out a mad scientist called Dr. Krieger, along with his series of mutated experiments known as the Trigen. There's the odd twist here and there, and the game does a nice job of building up a sense of mystery in its opening levels, but storytelling definitely wasn't Crytek's priority here. Most of the story is told through radio chatter and the odd cutscene, which are completely skippable and make up only a very small portion of this game's runtime. Really, the story isn't anything noteworthy, but I did like that it felt like a cheesy action movie since it never took itself too seriously, which made the journey through it a fun one at least. But the gameplay was where Crytek put all their effort in, and it's here where people are either gonna love or hate this game. There's no constant progression system, nor is there a seamless open world with tons of side content to burn through. It's instead a simple shooter made up of 20 levels, which have you completing a series of objectives in each of them before moving on to the next one. The best way to look at Far Cry nowadays isn't by comparing it to other entries, as it is viewing it more as a rough draft for the original Crysis. Besides the tropical setting, there's tons of similarities on a gameplay front, from the large and open-ended level design, the mix of stealth and action, the slow rate new enemies and weapons are introduced, it's all here. It definitely feels rougher though, with it being Crytek's first game and all, but they still got a ton of stuff right for their first crack at a shooter. Far Cry 1 is still a very linear game, but some of the environments here are downright massive, which can lead to tons of different pathways to stumble down or approaches to take. Some levels also have optional key cards, which are pretty useful for getting into armory stashes for health and ammo pickups. Tagging enemies so that they can show up on your radar was a mechanic introduced here, and during some levels you can even listen to enemy conversations play out.
Channels are down. It looks like we're under some sort of organized attack. Look sharp, people.
From here you can choose whether you want to go in guns blazing, picking off enemies from a distance, or creating your own plan of attack. The first few levels do a good job at easing you in, never being too easy or too hard besides the odd curveball thrown your way. The enemy AI really isn't the best, but they're positioned in just the right spots to catch you off guard. And so far things are good when you're slowly making your way throughout Far Cry. Guns still sound great and they feel satisfying to use thanks to fun ragdoll animations, on top of some nice environmental interactivity. They sometimes have an alternate firing mode too, though due to the recoil, firing in short bursts is ideal. And you can't talk about Far Cry without mentioning the game's graphics, which all things considered have aged nice and have this odd charm to them now. There's definitely some bland, ugly looking environments, but the beach levels are still colorful and vibrant, and sometimes feel dreamlike like something straight out of a Windows XP wallpaper. Once stacked up against other games from around this time period, it's clear Far Cry still stands among them as the most visually appealing of the bunch. Sounds are mostly fine despite the cheesy voice acting and dialogue, and while the music isn't anything I'd ever listen to outside of the game, it really does suit the action happening on screen. But not everything has held up over time, since certain elements like the stealth system definitely feel unpolished. You can hide out in tall grass and throw rocks to distract enemies, but I found that it never really worked out in my favor. Throwing a rock immediately put all the enemies on high alert, to where I found that it was easier to just poach them off from a distance. You do have a stealth meter, but you're not really given a ton of options to take a stealthy approach. There's a machete, which is pretty useless due to its low damage output, and there's a silenced SMG, and that's about it. And even then, stealth becomes pointless anyways once you get to the second half of the game and you're almost always forced into firefights. It's here where the game unfortunately starts to dip in quality, since the Trigen become a common enemy type at this point. The humanoid jumping and stealthy variants really aren't that much of a big deal, but the little ones are fast as hell and they're able to take you out in a full hit or two, which makes it annoying when it feels like they could take almost a full rifle magazine before going down. The worst of the bunch though were the ones called the Fat Boys, who can spam rockets and are basically massive bullet sponges. On top of that, more heavily armed soldier variants show up with RPGs and sniper rifles, which makes some of the later levels a chore due to a lack of quick saves, and relying on checkpoints just becomes frustrating really quickly. What makes it worse is that by this point, a few of the levels become more claustrophobic due to taking place in labs or bunkers, and dealing with these insta-kill or rocket spamming enemies really doesn't play out that well in tight indoor environments. Thankfully, these indoor levels don't make up a huge chunk of the second half, and there's definitely some cool set pieces like the Trigen vs soldier fights, or one part in the beginning of chapter 18 when you're wandering around this forest armed with nothing but a machete and an empty rifle. But while there's moments of greatness, there's plenty of frustrating ones, particularly during the vehicle sections. With how large the levels are and how slow you move, you'll need vehicles, but boats and cars don't really handle that great. It kinda feels like driving the Warthog from Halo, but they can't take much damage on top of that, leading to a pretty dull stop and pop approach for some levels like the swamp. And in the only instance when the game forces an on-rails turret section onto you, it made for a pretty painful ride with a bumpy road leading to missed shots, on top of a vehicle that blows up pretty quickly. The enemy tagging that made the earlier levels pretty fun doesn't stick around for long. In fact, by the end of the game you're encouraged more to use infrared goggles just to spot enemies in the environments, which is a little disappointing. And the few boss fights the game includes really just aren't that fun to fight. Far Cry was a very inconsistent game in terms of quality, but despite its glaring faults, it was never enough to get me to stop playing entirely. There's just some sort of frantic pace to it not found in some of the later sequels that makes it kind of hard to describe. It just throws so much at you that makes for some great action scenarios when you're just barely limping away in one piece, and there's definitely a sense of accomplishment in overcoming some levels like the volcano at the end. I know for sure I'm definitely not gonna forget that one anytime soon. The single player is about 8 to 10 hours or so on the challenging difficulty setting, and you're definitely getting a ton of content to play with given its cheap price tag. There's a statistics mode that unlocks once you clear the game, but it really doesn't do much besides giving you a result screen at the end of each level. Instead, what keeps you coming back to Far Cry is the built-in level editor, which ensures that the fun never really ends. There's definitely a passionate community even to this day, with tool conversion mods and gameplay tweaks to go through, and there's even new projects in development at the time of this video, which is a testament to how much some people really love this game. But this definitely isn't a game for everyone, not really due to its age, but more because of its difficulty and rough nature, though that's only to be expected as the first entry in this constantly evolving series. Mistakes were made, and even Crytek themselves admitted in a 2006 article that it was kind of rushed to compete against games like Doom 3 and Half-Life 2. While I don't necessarily love this 2004 shooter, I still respect it as a landmark title that helped pave the road for both Crytek and Ubisoft. Not anything I'd call a must-play today, but it's still worth a look for hardcore shooter fans that love a tough challenge. Far Cry 1 would later get its own unique versions of swords meant for consoles, each with their own set of gameplay and story tweaks to them, but it wouldn't get a proper sequel until 2008. Far Cry 2 would go on to massively revamp the formula and set the franchise on the path it's on now, but that's another discussion for another day.